As always, there are chairs in the front. What is it about us that we don't sit in the front? So please, please find a spot, and we will begin. Good evening, and my name is Diane Proctor, and I'm a member of the Reclaim Our Democracy group here at the First Parish in Concord. Reclaim Our Democracy has been in existence since 2016. It is my penchant to say 1916. I'm still trying to creep into this next century, but 2016, with a focus on helping to build a powerful nationwide democracy movement in order to repair our broken electoral system. Our focus this year is on nationwide Unitarian Universalist initiative called UU the Vote. And those of you who are members of the church probably heard about this past Sunday and perhaps attended a program that followed that in the afternoon. It will work to mobilize a young and underrepresented group of voters, challenge voter suppression, and I'm sure we're all aware of what's going on in Georgia and Wisconsin around voter suppression and the need for a great deal of attention and activity, and hold values-based conversation on issues that matter most, such as democracy, racial justice, a healthy environment, and equality. You can learn more about this effort at both the UU the Vote and the Concord Indivisible tables in the back of the room. And please enjoy the wonderful food and nibbles that are back there and after the program. And donations to support our work would always be gratefully appreciated. Before we begin, you should be aware that tonight's program is being recorded and will be available to view on MMN, the Minuteman News here in Concord, and on YouTube. Representative Tammy Gouveia will speak first, followed by Representative John Heck. There will be lots of time for questions and answers after they speak. We know that many of you will want to get home in time to see the Democratic presidential debates. So we'll be sure to finish in time for you to be able to get home, snuggle in, and watch. So let's get started. As we all know today, and we all realize, truth used to be such a clear notion, didn't it? We all knew the difference between what was true and what was not. Recently, however, truth has become harder to fathom. Tonight, we have two people who are willing to speak truthfully and courageously about the good, the bad, and the ugly when serving in the Mass State House of Representatives. It is a rare moment that we have a chance to hear people address with candor what their life is like. Elected in November 2018, Tammy Gouveia brings her expertise in public health, social work, her skills as a strategic thinker and collaborator, her passion for social and environmental justice, and her commitment to helping others achieve their fullest potential to the Massachusetts House of Representatives. In her first year in office, Tammy filed almost 20 pieces of legislation to address a range of issues, including childhood trauma, the opioid epidemic, public health, and the climate crisis. Within the House, she is spearheading efforts to address transportation funding needs, both as the chair of the Transportation Subcommittee of the Progressive Caucus and as a convener of the Route 2 Alewife Working Group focused on decreasing congestion on the Route 2 corridor, something we all live with and with which we are remarkably familiar, the Concord Rotary and the Alewife Parking Garage. Representative Gouveia is currently a member of the Joint Committee on Children, Families, and Persons with Disabilities, Joint Committee on Consumer Protection and Professional Licensure, Joint Committee on Mental Health, and Substance Abuse and Recovery, and a Joint Committee on Export. I have to admit, I don't know what that means. So I'm looking, who are you exporting? She is a graduate of Mount Holyoke College and received both her master's degree in social work and her master's in public health from Boston University, where she is currently studying opioid policies for a doctoral degree in public health. She is a proud social worker, a public health advocate, a mom, and an Acton resident, and we are very proud to have her represent us. Representative Jonathan Hecht was elected state representative for the 29th Middlesex District in November 2008. He serves on 4 legislative committees: Children, Families, and Persons with Disabilities, Municipalities and Regional Government, Transportation and Public Health. He is also an active member of the Progressive Caucus, the MBTA Caucus, the Fair Skies Caucus, and the Trails Caucus. Born in Cambridge, John grew up in Belmont, where he attended the public schools. He received a BA in History from Stanford, an MA in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts, and a JD from Harvard Law School. After practicing law in New York City, John worked from 1990 to 1994 as program officer for human rights and governance in the Beijing office of the Ford Foundation. He speaks Chinese, and I gather he speaks it rather competently. From 1994 to 1998, he was research fellow and lecturer in law at the East Asian Legal Studies program at Harvard Law School. In 1999, he co-founded the China Law Center at Yale Law School and served as its deputy director until 2006. In 2005, John was elected to the Watertown Town Council, where he chaired committees on budget and fiscal oversight, economic development, and rules and ordinances. He was previously president of the Watertown Community Foundation and a board member of the Arsenal Center for the Arts. You've been there in the summers or any time. There are fabulous programs there. John has also been active in Watertown Youth Soccer and the American Cancer Society's annual Relay for Life. John is married to Laura Sabin, a public health economist at Boston University School of Public Health. They have made their home in Watertown for 25 years and have 4 children attending or graduated from the Watertown Public Schools. We now turn this evening over to them and to you for questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane, for those introductions. That was perfect. And I learned so much about my dear colleague and friend here, Jonathan Hecht. Laura Sabin, his wife, is one of my professors at the BU School of Public Health in my doctoral program. So we have a couple different connections. The other connection that we have is when I was executive director of Tobacco Free Mass, I was in the gallery when Jonathan spoke on the House floor against the speaker deciding to go against his pledge of term limits. And that was one of my first signals that there was something amiss and something going on in the Massachusetts House of Representatives that might not be so great for democracy, certainly not great in terms of leadership and access to our government. And so that was one of my first signals that something needs to be done around this. So we're here to talk about ways that we can, in many ways, reclaim our democracy here in the state of Massachusetts. We pride ourselves on having the longest operating legislature in the country, which is really phenomenal. It's truly a privilege and an honor to serve on behalf of all of you in the House of Representatives. But there's a lot of work that we can do to increase transparency, increase the ways that the governance runs to make it much more effective so that the process leads to better policy making that benefits everybody in our state to make sure that everybody in the Commonwealth has what they need to thrive. And so we'll share some of our stories and observations and experiences with you. As you know, I was only elected in 2018, so have only been in the House for a year, but started to stand up for what I think is really critical leadership my very first day by voting present when the speaker vote came up. And there were 8 other of my colleagues who also took that same stance. And the reasons why I did that, I shared with the speaker because I think that we need a different way of leading in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. And we'll talk a little bit about what the implications have been over the course of the last 20 to 30 years, what's kind of happening with our colleagues and what the pressures are to sort of stay in line and to kind of follow along. And this is, in some ways, typical organizational development, typical, status quo. It really requires a lot of people within the system to maintain that system. And so it's the pressures to sort of keep along and go along are really, really clear. So I'm really excited to be here, to be a part of the truth-telling. You know, my dad used to always make fun of me. Oh, Tammy, you're too honest. Why do you always tell the truth? And there are ways that I'm very direct, and I try to deliver you know, my opinion and my position in a way that's respectful of the other person, and I look forward to us having a respectful conversation here about what's going on in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, while also holding people accountable to the positions that they've been elected to in the State House. So
Try using the wired mic instead of the other one.
use the wired mic, okay.
Getting a fair buzzing.
Yeah, I can hear it.
Sorry, did I buzz
Oh.
you?
Okay.
We'll see. Can you hear me? Okay, yeah, that's better. Oh, yes, thank you. Can you put this in front of you guys? Because it's a
Okay.
little awkward, I think.
Try not to
Can
mess
we
it up.
pull it? Yeah?
There.
All right, is that good?
Okay.
I'm sorry?
That's all right, we're
Yeah,
just
we're-
gonna keep you here.
Okay. All right, that was a little bit of a distraction. Sorry for the commercial break there. So one thing that I just want to say before I turn it over to my dear colleague to also do a little bit of an introduction here is the reasons why this matter. I talked about this a couple weeks ago when we had the impeachment rally and came into this very space. And one of the things I talked about is that there's so much at stake for our democracy here in Massachusetts. It's not just what's happening at the national level. And when I talk to friends and colleagues who are in other parts of the world, it also matters to them what we're doing here. And so I'm very proud to represent a district that I feel like in so many ways lives and breathes democracy, with the really founding of our country really starting here in this region. And I know that we take this incredibly seriously, and I take it seriously, but the implications are not just for what's happening right here. It really extends all across the world in terms of, you know, how we're leading, how we're making decisions, who's included in those decisions, who's left out of the decision-making table in the decision-making room. And, you know, we've had many of those kinds of experiences. So I look forward to answering your questions, but we'll kind of do a little bit of a back and forth. I'm going to turn it over to John, and then I'm going to take the microphone back, and then we'll kind of go from there. Thank you.
Okay.
There we go.
All right. That sounds like it's working. First of all, Tammy, thank you very much for letting me
No.
be here with you. Thank you, Diane, and the organizers for putting this together, and thank you all very much for being here. I think it's safe to say that you're here because you don't have rose-colored glasses on when it comes to the state of our democracy. And you recognize that democracy is not something we can take for granted, and that we need to be thinking about the state of our political institutions, thinking about who they empower, who they disempower, and thinking about what we can do to make sure that they operate in as democratic a fashion as possible. And I know that you've been focused a lot on issues of money in politics, and I certainly applaud you for that. And I applaud you for taking this, I think, further step of trying to really understand the structures and the operations of our political institutions, in this instance, the Mass House, and sort of understand the connections between some of the ills that we have in terms of the influence of money, the influence of powerful interests, and how these political institutions are structured and how they operate. I think that's a really important connection to always bear in mind. What you're doing and what we're doing our best to be part of at the State House is hard work. I'll be honest. I mean, I'm extremely encouraged that we're having this kind of an event. I think this is a very powerful sort of event to have, and I think there's much that we can do, and I'm going to talk about that, and I know that Rep. Gouveia is going to talk about that as well. But it is hard work, and we need to recognize that. It is ultimately about the struggle for power, the struggle for control of important institutions and the resources that they in turn control. So this is a real struggle. And when you're talking about institutions, you're talking about something very complex. Institutions are very complex. They're often opaque, I think, to outsiders. And I think that one thing that we can do to help in this effort that we're collectively involved in is to give you sort of that inside sense of how this particular institution works, and sometimes doesn't work very well. When we talk about the Massachusetts House in particular, I think the complexity and the difficulty of the task that we're involved in is magnified by the fact that in this instance, the really core challenge, the key challenge, which is to address the over-concentration of power in the leadership, in the Mass House, is something that's been in the making for a long time. It didn't happen overnight. It's really been, I would say, in the making for about 40 years. I think it's interesting just sort of to give you a sense of sort of how far we've come along that trajectory in an unhealthy direction as far as concentration of power. I like to quote a former speaker. This was Speaker Tom Finneran, who I think many of you will remember, who back in 2001, so almost 20 years ago, he was speaking on the floor of the House, and he made the following statement, and then I'll sort of give you a little bit of context for why he said it. He said, "I've become accustomed to setbacks. Setbacks and disappointment is the lot of a legislator, including the Speaker of the House." Now, that was 20 years ago. He had, in fact, experienced some setbacks at that time. He had just lost 2 votes in the House, one on a bill that he was pushing. It actually had to do with the operations of the House, that was rejected by his own Democratic colleagues and the House as a result as a whole, and another in which he was trying to prevent additional funding being directed. I think it was to legal aid and Medicaid. As you remember, Tom Finneran was not a very warm-hearted person, and he lost that vote as well. And that was actually not that unusual at that time. He, even though we think of him as sort of the quintessential iron-fisted speaker, he lost, I think it was 11 or 12 votes during his time as speaker. And all of his predecessors, and again, we think of some of them as, again, you know, the quintessential iron-fisted speakers. Tom McGee, I don't know if any of you remember going back into the 70s and 80s, had a reputation as an iron-fisted speaker. But he also lost votes, not infrequently in the House. So fast forward to today, and we have a speaker who has been in that position for 10 years. He has lost 1 vote in 10 years, and it was almost 10 years ago. So the degree of control that the speaker now exercises over the House is of an entirely different magnitude than what we even think of as sort of the heyday of iron-fisted speakers. And to sort of take that and sort of look at another indicator of that, back in the days of Tom McGee or George Kavarian or Charlie Flaherty or Tom Finneran, this is the speakers who served in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s and the 2000s, they oftentimes would see as many as 30% or even 40% of their own caucus, the Democratic caucus, which, as you know, has controlled the House for 70 years, vote against them openly on the floor of the House. Nowadays, you'd be lucky to see a handful of Democrats vote against the speaker. I think if in the prior full session, I think the percentage of Democrats who were willing to vote against the speaker on any measure over the course of an entire session probably was in the range of 3 to 5% of the body. So I tell you this just to give you a sense of how far we have come along this trajectory towards concentration of power in the House. And to try to explain that, I think the most important change that has occurred over that time is that the Speaker has accumulated, again, over the course of those 40 years, more and more tools, more and more levers to exercise control and to induce deference on the part of the rank and file, or really his entire caucus. Here I like to point to another quote from a former speaker, and this is now going back to the 1970s when the speaker was a man named David Bartley. I don't know if any of you will remember David Bartley, but and he was speaking specifically about a very important event that happened that I think sort of set us on this train that we've been on now for 40 years, which was a very well-intentioned effort that was ultimately successful. It was led by the League of Women Voters. It was approved by the voters as a whole. It was a constitutional amendment to reduce the size of the Massachusetts House. The Massachusetts House used to have 240 members in it. As a result of a push that was, I think, correctly intended to improve the quality of governance in the House, the number of representatives was cut to 160. And then the idea was that 160 members would have access to the same resources or even more resources, would become full-time legislators, not part-time legislators, and would have the support and the resources that they would need to deal as legislators with the increasingly complex work of law and policy making in an increasingly complicated state. I think what unfortunately happened was, of course, full-time legislators need certain things to be effective. They need staff. They need offices to accommodate that staff. And they need salaries that are sufficiently large to be able to devote themselves full-time to those duties. And the fatal flaw, I would say, of the House cut reform of the late 70s was that not enough thought was given to who was going to control those sorts of resources. And unfortunately, they all fell under the control of the Speaker. So today, if I want another staff member I've now been in the House for more than 10 years. I'm involved in a lot of different legislative work. I'm on 4 different committees, as Diane was saying. If I want to add additional staff to my office so that I can handle the increased workload, I have to go to the Speaker and ask him for permission. And in fact, technically, my current aide doesn't work for me. My current aide works for the Speaker. Now, in reality, she works very closely with me, and we are autonomous in terms of our work within my office, but technically she works for the Speaker. And if I were to seek another staff member again, I would have to go to the Speaker. Likewise, all of the office space in the House is controlled by the Speaker. And when you come to the question of salaries in particular, the degree of the Speaker's control has really, I think, become quite unhealthy. You may know that our base salaries as legislators are subject to a constitutional limit. They can only increase by a percentage that corresponds to the growth, I think it's in median household income in the Commonwealth as a whole. And that has not grown very rapidly in recent years, and in fact our base salaries are pretty modest. They're around $60,000. But there is the potential for much more compensation as a member of the House, but that entirely, again, depends on your relationship with the Speaker. And there, again, there's been a very large growth in the Speaker's ability to use salaries and additional compensation as a way to exercise control over the body. Back in 1978, at the time of the House cut, only 15% of Democratic members of the House were eligible for any sort of additional compensation. As of this year, the number of members who are eligible for additional compensation is over 2/3. 85 members, 86 I think it is precisely. And they are arranged, in those different stipends, as they're called, are arranged in a hierarchy, all the way from the lowest ones, which are for various vice chairs of committees that represent about a 10% bump in pay, to about 50% bump in pay, another $30,000, $35,000 if you're the chair of an important committee, up to about 100% additional pay if you're the chair of Ways and Means. So to a very real degree, members have become dependent in terms of their ability to both devote themselves full-time to their jobs as legislators as opposed to finding other work, and of course for their ability to support themselves and anybody else who's dependent upon them. That all depends on their relationship with the Speaker. And there's a sense of sort of moving up through almost like a corporate hierarchy from one level of stipend to another, again, depending on whether you maintain a good relationship with the Speaker. Another key commodity as far as one's effectiveness as a legislator is access to information and time to utilize that information to be effective in the legislative process. And as you may have gathered, typically on the House side, we have very little time and very little information when it comes to legislation that we're going to be dealing with on the on the floor of the House. We very typically do not receive the version of the bill that we're going to be debating in the House until the morning of the debate. And then the amount of time that's made available to debate that legislation, once we do receive it and once we do convene, has also been cut back substantially. If you go back into the 80s, the 90s, typically the House met in formal session to debate legislation for about 1,000 hours over the course of a 2-year session. In the last 2 sessions, that's been cut back to about 250 hours. So we have the time available to actually debate the legislation is about a quarter of what it was 30 years ago. So the point obviously is that in all of these critical ways in which we try to exercise our effectiveness, the Speaker's control has grown tremendously. And it's important to point out, this is way beyond what you see in other legislative bodies. If you look at the U.S. House of Representatives, for instance, they have a rule that all legislation must be available to members and, of course, to the general public, which is also important, 72 hours prior to debate. They have rules about seniority. They actually elect significant numbers of their leaders, whereas in the Massachusetts House, the Speaker makes all of those appointments to all of those stipended positions, regardless of seniority, any other factors besides those that he considers important. And then when it comes to salaries, in the U.S. House of Representatives, the only 2 people who receive any additional salary are the Speaker and the Majority Leader. Everybody else gets exactly the same amount of money. And as you probably saw back when some of our new representatives went to Washington a year ago, January, they assign offices by lottery. if you just look at our own Senate, the Massachusetts Senate, it is also significantly different in all of these respects. I mentioned that we typically get legislation on the morning of the day that we take it up. The Senate very typically distributes the legislation about a week in advance.
A week in advance.
Usually Friday before their session, which is normally on the next Thursday. They, again, have a much more egalitarian salary structure. They receive a budget to run their offices that they can use to hire whatever staff they think appropriate. In all of those respects, they have much greater control over all of those things that really make a difference in how you do your job. Tammy was speaking earlier about why this is important. I mean, of course, it's an affront to democracy to begin with, and I think that should be quite clear. It's important that all voices should be heard in the legislative process, and that's increasingly important in an increasingly diverse society such as we have. This kind of concentration of power, this sort of utilization of various forms of leverage to favor certain voices, to shut out other voices, or to induce self-censorship is the antithesis of what we should be looking for in a democratic legislature. As I mentioned, this extends, particularly in terms of access to information and time to be involved, also to the general public. We need to be engaging the public, not marginalizing the public by these sorts of scheduling and sort of information flow controls. And it's only in that way, by engaging the public, that the public has confidence that we are operating in an open and participatory way, and not passing legislation that has been subject to influences that are not openly seen. I guess finally I would just point out, I think it's an extension of sort of the issue of participation, but when a relatively small number of people are in a position to control the legislative activity, it inevitably influences what gets taken up and what doesn't get taken up. And we need to be moving toward a more truly representative agenda, one in which all legislators are empowered to contribute their ideas, not only to particular legislation, but to the broader legislative agenda. And I think that if you look at the history of the House under the current leadership, you can certainly see some areas, I think particularly about the environment, but a number of others as well, where the House just has not, I think, made a priority of issues that are very much priorities for the majority of people in the state, and I believe even a majority of the members of the House. And finally, I would just point out, when it comes to concentration of power, you're also obviously running some significant dangers that the founders and others who believed in more open participatory systems certainly wanted to avoid. Corruption is the most sort of the lowest common denominator. But coming back again to what we were talking about at the outset, I think it's particularly dangerous to have this sort of concentration of political power at a time when we have such enormous concentration of economic power. And I think it provides the opportunity for an unholy alliance that can really work very much to the disadvantage of the general welfare. So I do at some point want to talk, and I presume you would like to talk also about what we can do about this. But I've already used a lot of time, so I think I should stop and hopefully
I'm sure we
come
will
to
ask
that
you.
in questions or other points here.
Thank you, Rep. Hecht. I always learn so much just listening to what your experience has been, having been there a little bit longer than me. A couple themes that I want to pick up on before we turn it over for questions. There are some things that we have really already started to do to try to disrupt the status quo, so to speak. And those things really started, as I said, the first day of formal session last year, when the very first vote that we take as elected officials is voting for the Speaker of the House. There were 9 of us who voted present, which means we did not support Speaker DeLeo in being elected to Speaker. And then that continued. Other actions have continued since then and throughout session. I just want to highlight a few of those and then ask Rep. Hecht if he wants to add any additional points. On January 30th, we took up a rules package, really led in many ways by Representative Hecht, who's been thinking about how do we change the ways that the Massachusetts House of Representatives runs itself. And so we have rules that really are supposed to be the place that guides us in how we're supposed to be operating. And sometimes those are followed and sometimes those aren't. And I'll talk a little bit about an experience that happened in October where the rules were not really followed. But we were trying to open up and get greater access to information, as Rep. Hecht pointed out, trying to get 72 hours to review bills before we take them up and vote on them, having 24 hours to be able to file amendments to bills that get released, a couple others as well. And they did not pass, but there were a number of colleagues. There were 45 votes for one, 48 for another. So there is a signaling that there are representatives who do want to see things changed. But as we've sort of pointed out, the pressures are very real. There's money and staffing and other resources that are very real for people who, might have already a vice chair position or a chair position. So the pressures to, vote along with the speaker are pretty clear. The first messages that I and my first year colleagues got from leadership was, well, if you want to vote off, meaning you don't want to vote with the speaker, you need to let leadership know first. And oftentimes they'll ask why, which is fine. But you would think, and the perception is that our votes, that we get whipped for our votes. I've only been asked what my position is on one bill once this whole session. I don't know who's supposed to be whipping me for my vote. That does not exist. It does exist in Congress. I believe it exists in other states, but it has not been my experience as a first-year legislator for folks at the leadership level to, ask what my position is on a particular piece of legislation. So quite literally, there are days when we walk into formal session on that Wednesday, as Rep. Hecht said, not having seen the bill language prior to having to vote on that, a couple hours later. That puts tremendous pressure also on our staff. My staff is here, Emily Odgers, my legislative aide. Yes, thank you, she deserves a clap. So as a first-year rep, I have only one aide, and there are sometimes incredibly complicated bills that we are expected to weed through, understand, refer to MGL, chapter this, section that. Sometimes it refers to even IRS code at the federal level. So we're dealing with very complex and complicated pieces of legislation that it's really unconscionable in terms of me being able to legislate effectively on your behalf that have a tremendous impact. And what we oftentimes talk about is, I represent 45,000 people or so, just like Speaker DeLeo, just like any of the other folks who are in leadership positions. And so it's really an issue of fairness to be able to have access to information so that I can make the best decision that I think is in the best interest of the 14th Middlesex District, and all the representatives can be able to make those same decisions in the benefit of their districts. I want to talk a little bit about amendments and what pressure there is to not file amendments, to withdraw your amendments, to not speak on your amendments, and to not roll call. So one of the things that we spend quite a bit of time thinking about is getting votes on record. Because if you look at it, most of the votes that get taken up in the House are by voice vote. And if you've ever watched session, and I strongly encourage you to, and I can give you the link to help you figure out how to navigate so that you can watch session, or there are organizations that have clips of videos up that you can watch, just clips of session. So it might be eye-opening for you to just sort of see how it really works. And it goes very quickly. It's almost like an auction. I swear to God. It's like ayes, nays, the ayes have it. That's it. That's the vote. There's no actual recorded vote. So what that means for you is you could come to me and say, well, Tammy, what's your position on XYZ piece of legislation? And I could say to you, yeah, I support that. You have no idea because there wasn't a recorded vote. So in order to get a recorded vote, you need to have what's called a roll call, and you need 16 people, 10% of the body, and we're a lot worse than a lot of other states, their legislatures, and I think it's like the state of Texas, you only need one person to stand up to say that they want a recorded vote, and this is the case in, I think, 10 other states where it's very few reps need to stand up to say they want a recorded vote. In our state, you need to have 10% of the body, and so 16 people. And I oftentimes work with my Republican colleagues because of the pressures on our members, on our Democratic colleagues. They won't stand with me so that I can get a recorded vote. Oftentimes I can get 10, maybe 12 Democrats. I always need the Republicans to stand with me, which is not a bad thing. I mean, I believe in working together to solve the state's problems and make decisions and pass policy. So I don't have a problem with that. But it's just it's an indication of what the pressures really are on other members who otherwise probably are in agreement with many of the things that we're voting on. But the pressures are there. They don't want to stick their neck out and maybe lose their chairmanship or just be in the crosshairs of leadership in any way. So there have been, this ties in with amendments. So in order to, once a bill comes out, we oftentimes have a couple hours where we can file amendments, which is really also challenging because we want to make sure that we're writing, thoughtful amendments, ones that really reflect what our values are, that are really seeking to improve the legislation. And I have filed amendments, I think, 3 or 4 times, based on, on the House floor, right then and there. And been pressured pretty much every single time to withdraw those amendments. There's one I'd like to highlight in particular for you, which is we took up a bill for campaign finance reform. And the bill, the way that it came out of the House, eliminated the citizen positions on the commission that oversees the Office of Campaign and Political Finance. So the only folks who would be on it were elected officials. That makes no sense to me. I mean, it makes no sense to have a commission where there aren't average citizens on the body anyways, but particularly seeing the Office of Campaign and Political Finance. And so I filed legislation. Emily and I worked together I filed an amendment. Emily and I worked together on that amendment. And it would have added two non-elected citizens onto that commission. And I was pressured 4 times. Oh, we're not going to do your amendment. That's fine. You can tell me that you're going to vote no on it. I still want to move forward with it. And then they came back again and said, well, the positions that are on the commission, they already cover your concerns. I said, no, they don't, because they are elected officials who are on the commission. We need average citizens. And I was very, very firm in this. So I spoke on it, I roll called it, and I can't remember what the exact vote was. It did not pass. But what it means is that we have a recorded vote of all of the reps who voted to add citizens to the commission and all those who voted along with the speaker. And so it's just a story to really illustrate, what it really means to have people who are voting not necessarily with what is in the best interest of their district or in the best interest of the state or what their values really are, because the pressures are so strong. The other that I want to highlight, and you can see video of this, is, and I can't remember exactly when it was really early on in session. I'm going to go back to the other one first. Okay. Before 163J, I got another one. Okay. So the prior state representative, Cori Atkins, in her farewell speech, she called out some of these practices that are antithetical to effective governance in our democracy. And she talked about how when she was first elected into office, the vote board would be lit up in green and red like a Christmas tree, meaning that there were a mix of votes. Ever since I've been there, for the most part, you see all the Democrats vote green if the speaker votes yes, and you see all the Republicans, many of them vote red, voting against what the Democratic majority wants. There was one day in particular where, and I can't even remember what the particular piece of legislation was, but I was debating whether or not I was going to vote on a particular amendment, and everybody started, many of the Democratic colleagues had started to vote with the speaker, and it said, I can't even remember now what it was a yes vote? Well, anyways, it doesn't matter. So everybody voted, if the speaker had voted no, everybody had put up that they were also voting no, and so it was all red. And then all of a sudden, the vote started to switch to green. And I looked up, and because the division I sit in, I have a lot of Republican colleagues around me. So I could hear grumblings like, whoa, what's happening, what's happening? I looked up, and all the votes started to switch. And when you go back and you look at the video, you hear them say, the folks standing at the rostrum, Mikey, that's a no vote, and switch the votes. So it went from red to green, that's what it was. That's a no. And you can literally see everybody's vote switch once the speaker's, once the colored dot next to his name switched. And so that's another example of how, some of our colleagues are not necessarily either paying attention or aware of exactly what the implications are of their actions. Now, a lot of this has to do with the fact, again, that we don't have access to the kind of information that we need. Sometimes I can't get information on a particular bill, and I have to vote yes or no. I mean, those are my only options, to vote yes or no on a particular piece of legislation. So it's incredibly, incredibly difficult, and it does impact what happens in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. The one other example I'll highlight, and I think then I can pass it over to you, see if you have anything else, and then I think we should open it up for questions. We took up the supplemental budget in October, and Emily actually noticed that there was language in it that would have decoupled us from this section called 163J. And the ultimate effect of it would have been a corporate tax break to the tune of at least $37 million, plus opening up backdoor ways that large multinational corporations could hide millions of dollars in offshore accounts even more than they already do. And so I wasn't available. I wasn't in town. I was away on another business trip, kind of related to the legislature. And Emily found another state rep to file an amendment to strike out the language so that we could get rid of that corporate tax break within the supplemental budget. And we raised questions in Democratic caucus about it. There was a little bit of a back and forth. And I'm not sure what everybody's political leanings here are, but in the Democratic caucus, one of the things that was really unconscionable to me is comments that sounded like trickle-down economics, which, as a strong progressive Democrat, I don't believe in trickle-down economics. I think we've proven that has been an utter policy failure, and we're still contending with the failures of trickle-down. So I was pretty shocked to hear that from my Democratic colleagues. And we held firm, when we got to the House floor with the amendment, and we had alerted the clerk and the leadership that several of us wanted to speak in favor of our amendment. It's around 163J is the shorthand, that's what we call it, 163 amendment. And we were not called on. They silenced us. They called for roll call without ever recognizing us, even though one of my colleagues, Representative Sabadosa, was yelling from her seat, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker. If you go back and you watch the video, you can hear her, you can see what's happening down on the rostrum. You can't see her because the video's on us when we're at our seat in chamber, but you can audibly hear her. State House News, we have a news service within the Massachusetts House of Representatives, that they also reported that they could hear her calling to be recognized as they were gaveling to call for a roll call vote. So we only got to hear one side of the argument. And our colleagues were left without a true debate, a true conversation on the merits of the amendment as it was filed. And so our colleagues were put in a position where they were voting again on an amendment without having full and accurate information and hearing from multiple sides before they had to make a decision on that. And it kind of spiraled out a little bit, but the main point of the story is that there were representatives, myself included, Rep. Robinson and Representative Sabadosa, who were not given the right to speak on the House floor. And when I followed up with some folks in leadership, it was, we needed to move on. And, there were some interesting comments about, well, this is my job, is to just kind of keep things moving. So I think oftentimes we'll hear reasons of, or excuses that the reason why things are done this way is to improve efficiencies and to make sure that we're not staying there till 1 a.m. But what I see is a total disregard for the democratic process, and I don't really see too many ways that the House operates in ways that are efficient. We don't use technology the ways that we could. We sit around in chamber for hours and hours, just sort of waiting for them to come out from behind closed doors to tell us what we're going to be taking up next. So it's just, there are many more stories I think that we can probably share as we're answering questions. I think I'll pass it back to you, and then we can kind of move forward.
Well, I'll just say, first of all, I hope you all appreciate how unusual it is to have a first-term representative show the sort of principle and courage that Rep. Gouveia is showing. So my number one item on the list of things that you can do is make sure that she comes back.
Thanks, John.
I mean, the last anecdote that Tammy was talking about is, I think, revealing at so many different levels. Among other things, I mean, obviously it was, as Tammy has just said, it was a travesty in terms of a process of trying to decide a very complicated and very important issue of tax law. But it also just shows how the approach that leadership so often takes is self-defeating and leads us into stumbles. Because it was because of the courage of Rep. Gouveia and a number of her fellow first-term fellow female representatives that issue was surfaced. All too often things just sail through and nobody even notices. Because they had the courage to raise it, it attracted a lot of attention. It attracted attention, for instance, in the Senate, where they looked at it again and said, hey, we're not so sure it's a good idea to provide this additional deduction for business interest and blah, 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 blah. And that ended up, then the Senate took up the sub-budget. They passed it without that provision in it, and the sub-budget ended up being hung up for 2 months.
Here, here.
Well, here,
Yeah, in a way.
except
In a
we
way.
needed that sub-budget
Yeah.
done.
Yeah.
Because it had some important things in it. And there were a lot of programs that needed additional money, and there were collective bargaining agreements in there for teachers at community colleges who were waiting to get additional pay that they had negotiated and would have liked to have had for the holidays. It's just indicative of how a closed, non-participatory process many times leads to not bad outcomes and just stalemate, which is just foolish.
Yeah.
So it's a self-defeating strategy in many ways, but they keep doing it over and over again. Okay, so we should
This has
turn it over.
been so informative. I would like to open it up now for questions. I think we have 2 people circulating with 1 microphone. Do you all have the microphone? Okay. All right. So if you raise your hand, and please remember to ask a question, not give a talk.
I have gone with other people many times to hearings that are held at the State House, and I wonder how those hearings fit into what you're talking about, because it doesn't seem like you ever see the final vote at the time, and if you're on this speeding through kind of effort, where do you find the time for the hearing?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. So there's a couple things with committee hearings that I just want to point out. The first is both of us are on 4 different committees, and it's nearly impossible to always schedule those in ways that our committee hearings don't overlap with each other. So if you go to a hearing and you don't see a full panel of state reps and senators, it might be because they're in another hearing for another committee. So that's one thing to just kind of note. There are over 6,000 bills that get filed every single session, and only 2 to 3% of those pass in a year. So that's part of why you're not necessarily seeing legislation that gets heard at hearings making its way all the way through the whole process. And part of what happens is that things can get held up, particularly at the end of session, which is, we're heading into the second year of this particular session. So at the end of July, you'll see tons of bills that will just be sitting in Ways and Means, and no action is getting taken upon those. I will also say that every single bill that gets filed in the legislature is heard by at least one committee, and then oftentimes they're either referred to maybe healthcare finance or Ways and Means, and that's oftentimes where things just kind of do languish, or a bill, if it is going to make its way through the legislative process, or it is not going to make its way through the legislative process, will be sent to study. Committees have several different functions. It's not only the hearings that's the work of the committee. Committee chairs do have staff that help write legislation, so sometimes committees are working on their own versions of legislation. Sometimes they're taking a number of bills and packaging them together. Committees also go out into the communities and across the state and do listening tours to understand and hear directly from residents about what the issues are that are relevant to the purview of that particular committee. So I just want to paint a picture of a little bit more of what's happening with the committee process. I haven't been there long enough to really know what effect that your voice has in terms of showing up at committee hearings. I will say I learn a lot from people when they do show up, and I learn from the stories that you share, and I believe that my fellow legislators feel the same way. So it is really important to keep showing up. And what I've noticed since 2016 is just how many more people are engaged in the committee process, showing up for hearings. I see hearing rooms jam-packed with people all the time now. And I think that's incredibly powerful. And so I would encourage you to continue to show up for hearings. If you can't make it to a hearing, sending an email, sending a note is also really, really important. Please don't tag us on social media, though. It's really hard to have a conversation about complicated pieces of legislation on Facebook or Twitter. But do send in letters and do show up for hearings. Yep, you have a follow-up?
I just wanted to follow up. So there's a hearing. All these people come and talk about, for example, changing the state flag and so forth. You say you have 2 hours to vote on legislation. So as this comes, where in the process does this occur that this hearing takes place? It's not presumably within those 2 hours.
No. So hearings are scheduled, so we are typically in formal session on Wednesdays. That's not every single week that we're in formal session. Hearings happen typically outside of the formal session. So hearings are typically happening on Monday or Tuesday, and those are happening throughout session. And all bills need to have action taken on them by, I think it's now, we moved it to February. So all bills will be reported out of committee or sent to a study And that does not happen within the taking up on formal session. So if a bill is in committee and then it gets, say, reported out to Ways and Means, then Ways and Means needs to decide what they're going to do with it. Maybe they're going to make some refinements or make some further edits to it, and then they'll send it along the process before it gets to the House floor for us to vote on. But that's only 2 to 3% of all bills actually make it all the way through that process and onto the floor. So the deliberations around the merits of a particular bill that go through the committee process are happening with the committee staff, with the committee chairs. If it's a joint committee, it's the House chair and then the Senate chair are really looking at what are the components of this bill that might be worthy of continuing through the legislative process. So I hope that helps, but it's not within that 2 hours that we're taking that up. The committee process is happening in parallel. It's happening before it. And so just to paint a really quick picture, there were some pieces of legislation that we voted on very early on, as early as February and March. Those made it through the committee process really quickly. The reason why they made it through the committee process really quickly is they were bills that died, essentially, were not taken up and were not voted on at the very end of session last year. They were bills that had a lot of support, like banning conversion therapy and lifting the cap on kids. Lots of support in the legislative session last year, but it just didn't make it across the finish line. So we were able to shuffle those through the committee process quickly this year and get them to the House floor and take up a vote and get them signed into legislation.
Thank you so much. Let's get to, I think, Tom.
Hi, Tom Crosby, Concord. Listening to this, it seems that there are several constituencies and organizations which would seem to have a natural interest in bringing about a democratization of the process in the House. Certainly in terms of constituencies, everyone in this room, and probably everyone who voted for both of you representatives, would have that interest. But in terms of organizations, it strikes me that the state political parties, both the Democratic and the Republican Party, as well as another institution, what's left of the free press in Massachusetts, the 1.5 newspapers in Boston and those in Springfield and in Worcester, would also have an interest in pursuing this. And I'm wondering what you hear from them and especially what the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have to say about this situation and how to cure it.
Thank you. That's a terrific question. John, you want to take it?
Well, the Republicans, not surprisingly, have been harping on this issue for a long time. I think some of their solutions are not very good, but they have actually sometimes been, at least within the House, reasonably principled in advocating for a more open process. Your point about the press, I think, is important, and I think the reality is unfortunately pretty sobering. There used to be State House correspondence from a lot of the major media outlets. I'm not sure there are any anymore. The press has been so decimated by all sorts of forces that you know about, that they really don't get under the hood in any serious way in terms of what goes on Beacon Hill. Occasionally you'll see an article here or there, but they don't have the kind of permanent informed presence there that is necessary to really understand what's going on. I also think, unfortunately, the press to a degree, because the press is looking for access, but even some of the organizations that you would sort of think of historically, and I think to a considerable degree, they still are, good government organizations. Their behavior, and I say this with all affection toward them, has also been warped by this system, because they have bills that they want passed, whether it's automatic voter registration or public records reform or other things that they're looking for to open up government, to make government more participatory. And they know under the current system, they need the speaker to do it. So they have to walk a very, very careful line. Sometimes they've shown willingness to speak up a bit, but by and large, I think that they have felt that they've had to accommodate themselves to the realities of the power structure up there. So I don't think that they've played the sort of role that, at least with regard to House governance, that one would ideally hope they would. I mean, back again in the Finneran days, you may remember, there was a lot of public outcry about the way in which, he ran things. Again, ironically, that was child's play compared to what we have going on now. There just aren't those voices anymore, and I think it's, in the case of the press, because of the decline of that institution more generally, in the case of a lot of other organizations that you would think would be speaking out, they've sort of had to, they've had to accommodate themselves. It's an unfortunate reality.
Yes, we have a variety of questions. Okay.
My name is Catherine Lowe, I live in Maynard, so I have a different representative. I just have a question, and maybe you could shed some historical items. It seems to me like having 6,000 plus bills to deal with is crazy. And the first time I ever went to my rep and supported some bills, she said to me, I don't know those bills. I haven't had time to read them. I'm not going to say yes or no to something I haven't read. And it just seems like there would be a better way to streamline it right from the start. So historically, this has always been true. Is it true of other state legislations? And is there a solution to the zillion bills that get filed? Can't
Thank you.
Is that in our Constitution? It's in our Constitution, right, that we have to...
I have to have a hearing.
So it's in our Constitution that every bill has a hearing. In other states, I have heard that sometimes the way their laws are written, that they are limited by the number of bills that they can file. It's really challenging in our state to think that a rep might not want to put their best idea forward. Sometimes there are differences between bills that seem like they're almost identical, but those one or two differences can actually be pretty significant. So I don't think it's the worst thing to have these thousands of bills. I will say, my response when constituents ask me to sign on to a bill and sponsor a bill is I will take a look at it, and if I've already read it, then I'm probably already on it if it's a good bill moving us in the right direction. But my response is I will take a look at that bill because it is impossible for me to know all of those 6,000 bills. And my process at the beginning of session is if I hear from constituents and they say, I really want you to sign on to this bill, I look at it. And if it has good merits and I think it's really good for the Commonwealth and good for the district, I sign on to it. So it's hard for me to envision a change in that. I don't know if you see it differently, John.
I do think you're on to something in terms of having some system to sort of earlier on in the process kind of filter bills, because I think unfortunately sort of the correlate of the fact that leadership controls what number of bills ultimately get through, and Tammy referred to the 2 to 3% of the 6,000 bills that pass. I mean, I think that if we empowered committees, individual legislators, had a more open, active process, we could do a lot more bills. I mean, part of the reason we don't do more bills is that all the bills have to pass through the needle, which is the Speaker's office and the Ways and Means chair. And they don't have the bandwidth to do more. I think that's another downside of the situation that we're in. I think there are actually a lot of good bills. A lot of them have been thoroughly vetted. Nobody seriously opposes them. I have several, I think. They don't get done. And it's not for any reason other than the fact that they just don't have the bandwidth to do them. But what I was going to say is I think that knowing that and knowing that most bills aren't going to go through, there's a tendency to throw in a lot of junk bills. And I think we could try to develop a system to kind of filter out some of the bills that have not really been thought through very well. And then at the same time, kind of open up the process so that a larger number of the worthy bills would get the attention that they,
That they
deserve.
Yeah. Thank you, yes.
I am wondering, I thought I could speak loudly enough. I'll take advantage of this. This is fascinating, and although I know both of you, and I've worked in the state for over 40 years, I learned details tonight I've never learned before. So what do we in this room do? I mean, voting for you, Tammy, isn't enough. Unless we all move to Winthrop and run a rogue Democrat against Toledo, I don't know what we can do. And I'm looking for your advice. Should we be looking at some sort of citizen initiative like the millionaire's tax? But would that wind up making it even harder to be a legislator? But I'd really like your advice. I mean, what can we do, having heard what we heard tonight?
Yeah. So I'm an optimist, I'll be honest. I don't know if I could do this job and do it as well as I think I'm doing it without having some hope and some optimism. And what gives me hope and optimism is that there are a number of races that are going on right now because reps have vacated their seats, and so there are campaigns that are going on. And what's coming up in conversation in those campaigns is that people who are running are paying attention to transparency, effective governance, how we can increase, making our democracy much more representative. I mean, that's one of the downsides of the ways that reps are compensated. $60,000 to live in this area as a single parent is really challenging, I'll be honest, right? And so it means that in other parts of the state that also have high housing prices and high costs of transportation, et cetera, that you're not seeing the kind of representation that maybe would benefit that particular district. So it matters for the kinds of representatives that we get in the body. But to go back to your question, getting other reps, new reps who are running in these particular races, who are paying attention to transparency and they're bringing that conversation into their races, I think is really encouraging. Massachusetts is also one of the states that has the lowest rate of challengers against incumbents, and we're starting to see that change. There are a number of races that are going on where there are challengers, and part of what's being raised in the conversation is exactly what we're talking about here tonight. So that gives me hope and encouragement, and that's something probably for you all to just be aware of and to pay attention to what the signals might be that come out of some of those races.
Yes.
Did you want to add to that, though?
No, John,
I think
you want to add to it? I'm
John
sorry.
I'll try to
Yeah.
quickly add. First of all, again, don't underestimate the importance of making sure that Rep. Gouveia comes back. Because a small number of people really can make a big difference. And the small number of people who have come in this last cycle, and there's a fair number, when I say a fair number, 6, 8 new reps who came in, some of them having committed in their campaigns, and others who, once they got to the House, recognized what the problem was, who are really working to make things change. And it's already having an impact, and I believe that if we can grow that number, even, again, marginally, it's going to have an outsized influence. So if you know people in some of these other districts that Tammy's talking about where there are open seats, or even where the issue of transparency and participation has become an issue for a sitting rep, there's an opportunity there. The other thing that I just want to mention is that there is some thinking going on, and there's more that needs to be done, and some organizing going on around the sorts of structural reforms that we need to make. And I just want to recommend to you this paper that just came out in November called Mass Forward, that was put together by the folks at Mass Inc. and the Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts, which talks about a number of issues, some of them having to do with the political process, the electoral process, But there are also a number of specific recommendations in here about the operations of the legislature. They speak generally about the legislature, but it's really about the House, including some of these issues about staff that we were talking about, including the idea of creating a new legislative research bureau, which is something that exists in a lot of other legislatures around the country, which serves as a source of independent analysis for legislators on legislation. So it fills in that sort of information gap that unfortunately we operate under a lot of the time, and that sort of staffing deficiency that we operate under. And the fact that this is out and that people are talking about it and that they have some specific suggestions is, again, another encouraging sign. And I think we need to find a way to organize statewide behind some of these sorts of ideas, whether it's through an initiative petition. It really depends on what you're talking about, because under the Constitution and under the usual rules of legislatures, you can't mandate the rules of a legislature through the Constitution. The Supreme Court of our state has made clear that that's something that's within the purview of the legislature itself. I mean, I suppose you could try to come up with some constitutional language to constrain that, but I'm not sure that's going to be a very good way to go. But there are other options out there we need to pursue.
We have time for just one more question, I believe. So,
This is Shaw Concord. So just following up on the earlier thread, we need more people who can fight for transparency at the State House. I just want to bring up to the attention of everyone that the District 37, Massachusetts District 37, Jen Benson seat, she just resigned as of January 8th, I guess. Special election coming up in March. There's only one Democratic candidate running, Dina Sandfield, and she has pledged last night at the individual actor meeting to act on mass that she will support this pledge of transparency. Okay? Very rushed elections. If you want to help her, donation is always the best. There's only 2 months. She needs to. Actually, March 3rd is the primary, March 31st is the general election.
okay, thank you so much.
Just one comment.
Fred.
We're into movement building here.
Yes,
This is being recorded.
right.
The more we can get this message out to people, the better chance you have. Is that right?
Absolutely.
So all of us in this room can play a role in helping fix it.
I just want to thank the two of you so much. I mean, this has been astonishing. And I also want to thank Fred Van Duzen, who just had the microphone.
Yeah, thank you, Fred.
And the Reclaim Our Democracy Committee, which has worked so hard and will continue to work very hard. It reminds me, Fred, that perhaps given the national tenor of things, our attention has been spent, a lot of our attention has been spent on what appear to us to be other urgencies and other issues. But hearing what you said today, it seems to me the League of Women Voters, Common Cause, a crowd of people who care about these issues need to organize and need to speak. That you have to change it internally, I understand. I've been a teacher all my life, so I presume people could hear me, and I'm sorry if I was rude and should have used a microphone. But I think that, I think that we cannot be complacent about an issue like this, and anything we can do to support our legislators who want change, whether it's writing, whether it's attending events and speaking out, or organizing our own organizations to address these issues is very important. Thank the First Parish for making this whole program possible.
Thank you.
The Reclaim Our Democracy Committee for doing its very fine work. Don't forget to have some of the wonderful food in the back of the room. Sign up for Concord and Indivisible, and we look forward to talking with you individually after the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.